the thing we have in common here is that we all love photography, and we all love silver, and we love light. And we want to use those tools to make pictures however you see them with your own eye, with this incredibly hand-on process. I basically was an art director for 35 years, and I learned photography by being frustrated by photographers that I couldn't control in photo illustrations. So I just said, give me the Nikon and show me what an f-stop is, and back in the 1960s. And I learned photography just by doing it. I'm only a high school graduate. I'm not a teacher. I've spent my life in art as a designer and as a photographer. So my credentials are here as I have 20 years in the field, not in a studio per se, but in the field, working with this process. I used to do Civil War reenactments. That's the way I made my living. Extra money when I was art director, and it was good money. But I'm finding, I had a full 32 feet of canvas to set up, and it was really hard for me. But it really was a way to learn, because I had to produce portraits consistently all day, every day. And I was just making money. And so it was a good way to teach myself. But now that I'm getting older and people tend to want to know what I know, I'm starting to teach workshops, and thus I designed this manual and kind of entered into a new phase of my life of becoming the old guy in the business. In this business, I am the old guy. There's only a handful of us left that have been working like this many years in the process. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of new people. But you are entering into a very select crowd here worldwide. There's probably there's less than 1,000 people in the world that know this process. And when you're speaking worldwide, that's a very small crowd. If you read the names of some of the people, most all of them are my friends. It's a small world. And welcome to it. But there's dues to pay, and the payment will be, as you go along this week, you'll begin to see some of the problems. I can't even tell you where we'll get an image today or tomorrow. There may be problems from the get-go, and it may be a perfect week. We just have to start and see how it works. Because there's a whole new set of organic chemistry there that I'm not controlling. It came from another source. So we have to mix up the stuff and hope that it works. It doesn't always work. There's 1,000 things that can go wrong, but mostly it works. And if it doesn't, usually I've got another card up my sleeve to make it work. My reference point, as I first said in Collodion, has always been historic. I learned to love photography differently than Ron learned it. I saw the early books. My mother realized that when I was very young that I liked history. But I was an artist. And I found there was a good marriage between the art of photography and the historical photography. It gave me a marriage, if you may, between an old process that I used to look at the Civil War pictures of Brady, Sullivan, Gibson, Gardner. And I used to see these pictures of these guys with these big old box cameras and hauling them around and setting up tents and wagons and their what is it stuff. And it was like, that's what I wanted to do. It took me 40 years to do it, but I finally, when I did it, I knew that I had reached into an area of my life that was what I was going to be. And it had formed very early by looking at early historical magazines, photographs. So before I was a shooter, I was a collector. I collected tons and tons of early photographs. But now that I'm a shooter, I don't collect much. It's like one led to the other. So consequently, what you see here is like 2 historic pieces. I have 10 original wet plate cameras now and about 25 different lenses. And it's like you never have them. If you've been into photography, there's never enough cameras, never enough lenses. The problem is when you start dealing with the old stuff, it gets quite expensive. And each camera has its own story. They're all boxes with lenses. It doesn't matter. They'll all take pictures. I showed you yesterday we're going to be shooting with a 1920 box camera. To show you that it only takes a $5 camera to do this process. The first camera I have here is a French box. I tend to call the cameras boxes because that's what they are. There's boxes that have bellows and there's boxes that have inner boxes that slide. Most of the cameras were bellow boxes. The early slider boxes were usually daguerreotype cameras. The history of the process began with the invention of photography. There's a lot of arguments these days as to who invented what. But we tend to believe that a fellow named Niepce and Daguerre learned to make an image on a silver-plated copper plate. And they would do that by fuming iodine onto this plate. And later an American figured out that additional fuming of bromine would accelerate and give better contrast. They would put this in the camera and expose it. And then they would develop it with heated about 180 degree mercury. Very lethal, and that mercury is odorless and vaporless. So these guys were breathing this stuff and not knowing they were breathing this stuff. And as you well know, heavy metals go in your body and they don't come out. So they would start showing signs of blindness, kidney failure, liver dysfunctions, Lord knows what else, insanity. You heard of the saying, mad as a hatter. Well, you could say mad as a daguerreotypist too. Brady got out of it in the nick of time. The daguerreotypes, he was an absolutely lousy wet plate collodion practitioner. I have several of his ambrotypes. I wouldn't have sold them. I'd have thrown them in the trash can. And he writes in his journal that he had a difficult translation between the daguerreotype period, of which he was an absolute master and won worldwide contest. You know, he photographed, people, presidents of the United States and the famous actresses and stuff. His work is just magnificent. But his transition into wet plate was awkward. Wet plate began with the invention by Frederick Scott Archer. William Fox Talbot in 1839 also, along with Daguerre, invented, and he was in England, Daguerre was obviously in France. Niepce died, Daguerre processed the thing through to a French patent and a lifetime pension. And at the same time, within a month or two, Fox patented the Collodion, which is a wax paper negative, and onto a salt print. Whereas that pretty much dominated the world of photography until 1851 with Archer's invention of collodion, which is a relatively new chemical, which is nitrated cotton dissolved in nitric acid, and then redissolved in ether. And that made a substance that we use here, and we pour that on glass and on metal. For him, it was on glass. And unfortunately for him, Fox Talbot contested it as his, and because it was photography, and the English really didn't get a handle on their own invention until the mid to late 50s, when the English courts finally disagreed with Talbot, and he said he could not own the word photography. And the wet plate photographers then in England began to produce work. Unfortunately for the English, the Americans had a head start on their process, and from 1852 on, the Americans were very prolific with wet plate collodion, to the point where Americans have always been looked at as they produced more photographs than all the world combined. It just was a love affair that still goes on today. America just loved photography from the get-go. So in 1856, using the same invention of Archer, a fellow named Hamilton Smith, a chemist in Ohio, figured out he could put the same collodion onto a piece of blackened iron, and thus patented the melanotype, which means black type, and had a fellow named Neff, N-E-F-F, in 1856 to produce these really heavier than usual iron plates that were japanned on one side and lightly washed japanned on the backside. When the trade opened up with Perry in Japan, they were bringing over these black lacquered boxes. And so just like the name melanotypes and ferrotypes became tintypes, anything black and shiny to Americans became japanned. So japanned is just a derivative of black lacquer, but japanning is not black lacquer, it's black asphalt. And they would take asphalt with just mineral spirits, and they would add Canadian balsam for flexibility, and they would heat it, and they would brush it onto a plate on both sides and put it into like a wood-fired oven. They would have like today's smoker boxes. They have a huge fire over here, then they'd have a cooking box here, and they would have it filtered so no ashes would get in. And they would heat the plates and dry them, and then they would brush the emulsion side, not the back side, another time or two even, and cook them until they had a really deep black shiny finish on one side, and the back would always be a washed, almost a brownish wash color. And those were called japanned plates. So it's 100% asphalt, mineral spirits, and sometimes Canadian balsam. And they're made today. I make them. But I basically take a blackjack, I think it's number 624, roof and foundation coating. And if you look at it, there's different varieties. All you want is 100% asphalt and 100% mineral spirits. No clays, no emulsifiers. Obviously, no asbestos, fibers, nothing, just straight. And I take that, cut it by 50% paint thinner, and just dip my iron plates into it and bake it in a converted barbecue propane grill on racks for 20 minutes of high heat, and it makes it a hard finish. Unfortunately, it smells like somebody's roofing in the neighborhood, and it's very obnoxious if you did it around the clock. That's why I don't do it for other people, because my neighbors are tolerant of me. They know I'm going to hit the road when they smell the roof asphalt smell. I use a copper pan with an iron rack that I put the plates up in. Instead of a wood drying rack, I have just threaded stock and angle iron, and I stack them up vertically. And then they close the lid to the barbecue. A reason why I like the old propane barbecues is you can get them for $100 or less, and they're designed to vent off the smoke through the backside. So versus building your own, you can even build them. They have all the place for the propane, the burners, and the control knobs, and then they have an actual, most of them are aluminum, and you just they're nice and clean, and when they smoke, just like for grilling smoke, they've got them so they come up to the top and they vent off through the back. So you don't even have to create a chimney for them. And they're designed that way, so if you get too strong of a concentration of smoke, the flames can actually ignite and create an explosion. But with the barbecue design, it won't do that. Don't spend a lot of money building a box, just buy the propane barbecues. On page 12, here's a picture of what the inside of my barbecue looks like. We will not be using Japan plates because it is too difficult for any of you to do this. So we're using a plate called trophy metal, which is, you'll see later on, but it's made by a company that makes trophy plates for engraving, and it's a highly black enamel aluminum plate, and has a piece of cellophane you peel off, which means the plate is perfectly clean, and we pour onto that. And that's what most of everybody's using anymore. Rob Kendrick of National Geographic has paid great money. He told me he has 2,500 5x7 Japan plates in his reservoir, but no other source to make them at this point. The craft of collodion is really unique in that with a lot of photography, they say, it's not archival, so it ages. The reds go out and leave the blues alone. With collodion, it doesn't happen. Collodion stays the same. The images that you make today will look the same in 200 years. Ironically, one of the first few processes man ever created is one of the most archival. Now, if you don't varnish the plates, silver, of course, will oxidize black, and you'll see antique tin types that have blackened or have that kind of a funny halos marks around them. That's an oxidation that cannot be fixed. Recently, the Billy the Kid shot went totally black because they didn't follow the archivist Grant Romer's suggestion back in 1988 of how to preserve that image. It was already darkening because it wasn't varnished. However, images made in the 1850s that were varnished are as good as the day they were made. So if some guy, whoever a guy was that shot Billy, had varnished his image, it would still be intact. When you work in this process, whatever you do today will last for centuries. They don't know how long it'll last because still, 150 years later, it's still intact. So aside from water rusting the plate, aside from somebody sitting on it, aside from you putting it in the bright sunlight every day, which still I think would not affect it, because you, in essence, the varnish we use is an amber-style resin called sandriac from North Africa. It's a relative of the juniper tree, and that, in essence, mixed with alcohol and lavender, seal off any air to the silver on the image. And so the silver is like sealing an insect in amber. It's still intact through the millenniums. And that's the way the image is with a tintype. It's sealed for the millennium. So it's kind of a cool thing. You know, what you make today, and if you varnish it, will never age in the sense of a color photograph from the 50s or an improperly fixed silver image from the 1920s or 10s. The daguerreotype's an easier process. And it's not as demanding in that you can hold on to your plate for a while before you develop it. Whereas wet plate, you have to have your darkroom with you, and according to the weather, on a nice warm day, just like today will be probably 85, we will have 10 minutes to process the plate. But if it's 95, we'll have 5 minutes. If it's 100, you go get a glass of iced tea and sit down and wait for it to cool off. Because the ambient temperature not only evaporates the ether-based collodion, but also heats up your iron and glass. So you have a double problem as you pour the ether-based collodion. It's already, the glass in your hand is already hot, or the metal. So you put ether on a hot surface, you can imagine how fast it's going to dry. Well, there's a point of diminishing returns there, how fast you can move, because if you can run even with that plate, time you get it out of the silver bath, the more it is allowed to dry, which means you can't hardly outrun it because it's drying faster than you can run, the longer the exposure is. What you'll start seeing is black parts of the bottom of the plate will just be totally unexposed because it dries from the outside in. So you'll start seeing it drying, and if you develop a plate on a hot day, you see like the bottom's black or the side's black over here, means that part of the collodion already dried on you. So there's no image there. So there's a point where you can't run fast enough. And in fact, as if on a hot day, your exposures become longer because you're trying. And if it's longer and the plate's hotter, what happens? It does more drying. So there's a point where you can't beat it. That's the craft of it. You have to work within a parameter of exposure versus development versus drying time. And it's a cycle that keeps you moving. And the fact that it's a wet process, Brady and these guys didn't like it because it had artifacts. You touch it from the side of the plate, it'll draw in. Just like you ever touch like something that's got water on it, and you touch it, and just you see whatever it is, just oil off your hand or something, just draw across the surface. Well, the collodion's the same way. You touch it with dirty hands, or even just normal oils, it tends to draw in a little bit. What's off your hand? So you always want to keep your hands clean. In the meantime, back to the equipment. This is an 1871 Anthony. It was as big as Kodak back then. E.A. Edward Anthony and brothers. E.H.&T Anthony, to be exact. They are the largest supplier of camera equipment. Anthony actually worked with Brady in his New York studio in the 50s. Anthony got a clue that daguerreotypes is going to make him sick. So instead of quitting photography, he became a retailer. Where Brady went on to try wet plate. Ultimately, we all know his end in the Civil War as a photojournalist.